mob and the media's high praise of President Joe Biden, it's getting harder and harder for the Biden protection program to hide Joe's erratic outbursts and downright nasty comments. Now, just this week, during his big summit with Vladimir Putin, Biden snapped at a CNN reporter when she asked a very reasonable question. Take a look.
Why are you so confident he'll change his behavior, Mr. President?
Yeah, I'm not confident in changing behavior. What the hell? What do you do all the time? So when did I say I was confident?
And of course, Biden's most recent outburst is just the latest in a pattern of lashing out at reporters when they ask questions that he just doesn't like. Take a look at this.
How is your role as vice president in charge of policy in Ukraine and your son's job in Ukraine? How is that not a conflict of interest?
It's not a conflict of interest. There's been no indication of any conflict of interest from Ukraine or anywhere else. Period. I'm not going to respond to that. Let's focus on the problem. Focus on this man, what he's doing that no president has ever done. No president.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions, but I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black. When I announced it, you all said it's not possible. Come on, give me a break, man.
Come on, you guys.
That's a good start. 100 million. Thank you.
Meanwhile, podcast host Joe Rogan has had just enough of this far-left hypocrisy and called out fake news CNN's Brian Stelter this week. Listen to this.
They were saying, there's people on YouTube right now that get more views than this show. This is because the market is spoken. Right. And your show's terrible. Brian Stelter talking to the press secretary saying, what are we doing wrong? What are we doing wrong? Like, hey, mother, you're supposed to be a journalist.
Joining me now for reaction, Fox News contributor Joe Concha, alongside conservative columnist Monica Crowley. All right, good evening to both of you. Joe, I'll start with you. The mob and the media's high praise is really stunning to me. I mean, how do these people look themselves in the mirror after they talk about how great Joe Biden is when he is literally falling apart in front of us?
Well, Judge, I guess they look at the mirror and then they turn to their perhaps something next to their bed where they keep maybe a little safe sort of thing, and they count their money and they say, oh, OK, it's all OK. We can be as phony as we appear to be. Look, a couple things to unpack here. Caitlin Collins should be profoundly disappointed with many of her colleagues who didn't run to Twitter, who didn't run on the air to defend her after that question. And it shows you how phony the outrage was when Donald Trump pushed back against reporters when he felt there was an unfair or dishonest question that was posed. But here's the reason why there was no joint presser between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden. Because Biden's M.O., Judge, is, on the rare occasions he actually does a press conference, take maybe 7, 8, 9 questions from hand-picked reporters chosen by his handlers. From there, he reads some of those answers verbatim off of note cards, written form. Then he runs off the stage, maybe takes one question on the way out. If Biden was paired with Putin, he would not have, and he being Putin, would not have allowed Biden to leave so quickly. He'd probably keep him on stage for an hour, maybe 2 hours, like a heavyweight championship where one fighter knows that he's going to beat the other one, but he wants to punish him for a while. He would force him to take multiple questions outside of his comfort zone while testing Biden's mental endurance. And based on Biden's meltdown over one decent question by Caitlin Collins, that would have been a catastrophe, Judge.
Well, and, you know, Monica, the amazing part of this also is that you now have Joe Rogan, who is loved, has an incredible podcast, who's calling out CNN, Brian Stelter, and, you know, criticizing him, saying he's basically a, not a great guy, not a great journalist.
Yes, and I give total props to Joe Rogan for calling out Brian Stelter and all of his colleagues at CNN. Look, Rogan is thriving because he's authentic. He's an independent thinker. And people are starved for that because they're not getting it from the propagandists in the media. So his audience has just exploded because people want no BS, no nonsense. They want the truth. They are certainly not getting it from Brian Stelter and CNN. And you know what's so revealing about that exchange and Biden's reaction to Caitlin Collins is it shows how thin-skinned and how what a short fuse Joe Biden has, right? Because that question came from a reporter at CNN, the most sycophantic, bootlicking, pro-Democrat network, and Biden still blew a gasket. That points to a bigger issue, Judge. For decades, Democrats, leftists, progressives, they have been so coddled and so protected by the so-called mainstream media that they're not used to getting a tough question. And by the way, that question from CNN was thoroughly benign. They're not used to being challenged even in the most benign kind of way because they never have. So when they're confronted with a question like, do you think, are you confident that Putin is going to change? He blows up. And you see this time and again. He's used to getting questions like, what is your favorite flavor of ice cream? Like he got a couple of weeks ago.
Monica, let me ask you.
It
Monica,
is madness,
when you
and the
said
American
this,
people are not
Monica,
getting the truth.
Monica, when you say that it points to a bigger issue, not just the coddling by the mainstream media, but the irritability and, you know, the sentences that seem to have no end and go on and on, are they signs of a bigger cognitive issue?
Well, that's something I think that Ronnie Jackson and others have raised, that President Biden, I think, needs to prove that he is up to this job, because some of these reactions just do not show a commander-in-chief, an American president, in control. Now, remember when President Trump was in there, the press was combing over every little utterance. Remember, they would say President Trump is unwell. They had no basis in fact for that whatsoever. They were combing through every annual checkup that President Trump had. They do this with every Republican president. And yet we've got a Democratic president in there where the press just throws up their hands when it's clear to everybody that there is some issue here. And yet no questions are raised.
Right.
It's a thoroughly corrupt press corps.
Well, and you know, Joe, when one of the sound that we played had to do with Joe Biden, who was very on top of his game. Whenever it came to Hunter, he would say, there's no conflict of interest. There's nothing wrong here. I'm not going to answer that. I mean, he was well prepped on that. But, you know, it is amazing that he was able to get away with that and continues to be able to get away with it when, as we just said in the last segment, that, you know, Hunter's getting up to $500,000 for his artwork, and the guy's not an artist. And, you know, is it going to be this way for the next 4 years?
I'm not sure about that, Judge, only because I look at the numbers, I look at the ratings, I look at the clicks, and everything is plunging. At CNN, for example, CNN's media show has lost 8 in 10 viewers, a ratings plunge of nearly 80% since the beginning of the year. That is consistent with the entire network. MSNBC down nearly 50% since the beginning of the year. You look at the New York Times, the Washington Post, subscriptions are down when they rose, obviously, during the Trump administration. So at some point, I would think that these folks would say, you know what, maybe we really should start doing our jobs and hold the powerful accountable despite party, without fear or favor to party. If you want to stay in business, maybe you do that instead of being so profoundly predictable. And the numbers, they tell the story, Judge. That's the bottom line.
Well, it'll be interesting to watch over the next few months, especially as Monica indicated, the call by Dr. Ronnie Jackson, now Congressman, to have the president submit to a cognitive test. Joe Concha, Monica Crowley, thanks so much for being with us.